Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at economic history through two lenses. In the second half of our show, Edward Stringham, professor of economic organizations and innovations at Trinity College and the author of Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life, is going to try and convince us that people do pretty well when allowed to arrange their own affairs. Up first, we're pleased to welcome business and economic historian John Steele Gordon, author of 7 books on those subjects, and a frequent commentator on Marketplace, heard on NPR. John, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
John, last night I finished reading your now classic book, An Empire of Wealth, Rise of the American Economy, which is a delightful romp through the economic history of our country. Why is it important for contemporary Americans to hear these old stories of success and failure, innovation and corruption, and the roots of the historically unprecedented prosperity Americans carved out of the wilderness?
Well, I think there are several reasons. One, of course, is you can't understand the present unless you know how we got here. And that means you have to look at the past. And unfortunately, a lot of history teachers think that history is all about memorizing dates. And dates are important. You have to know the order of things. But history is full of fascinating human beings and great stories. And these are often very entertaining stories. And people like stories. And so they listen to them. And then they learn something despite themselves.
Take us back to the very beginning. We were bequeathed a unique set of values, laws, and customs by our British forebears. Which were the most important to our success and why?
Well, we certainly were very fortunate in who our mother country was, in that the English were not very interested in the colonies, and they more or less let the colonies govern themselves. And so we learned very early on about self-government. And if you look at the difference between the United States and Latin America, where the Spanish government ran everything, when they achieved their independence a generation after us, they had no idea how to run a country. And so Latin American politics have been mostly a disaster. I think it's beginning to change now for the most part. But, it was the whole history of dictators and coup d'etat and what have you.
Right. Well, there's a lot of trial and error in the American colonies. Not everybody set out with the same plan.
No means. A lot of the colonies were established basically for religious reasons. The Puritans wanted to build a shining city on a hill, and William Penn wanted a refuge for Quakers, and Maryland was supposed to be a refuge for Catholics. And New York was established for the one sole purpose of making money. The Dutch didn't give a hoot what your religion was. And, even to this day, that little Dutch village only lasted 40 years, but to this day, the great metropolitan area of New York is still that let's make a deal village.
It's quite a lasting impact, but it took a while to get there. Agriculture, trapping, and export really drove the colonial American economy as part of the British imperial system. Why did we end up profiting from it so much more than the mother country did?
Well, the mother country profited pretty well. We had, of course, a much larger country. We had many more resources. Britain is relatively resource poor, which doesn't prevent you from becoming very rich. It was a great trading nation. It still is. But I think in some ways the British, although they invented the Industrial Revolution, they then sort of lost their way a bit. And the government became more paternalistic, more socialist. And they stopped innovating. One big difference is that in Britain, a man would found a company, be very prosperous, get very rich, and what would he do? He'd then buy a country estate, send his sons to Oxford or Cambridge, marry them off to the aristocracy, and he'd become gentry, no longer interested in running the big company.
We had a very different culture here. In fact, a culture that's so different, smuggling was an honored tradition in the colonies. Who were some of our greatest smugglers?
Smugglers? Well, Rhode Island was the center of smuggling. In fact, one of the reasons Rhode Island didn't ratify the Constitution until July of 1790, because the Constitution gave the federal government power over imports and exports. And Rhode Island wanted to keep on with its smuggling industry.
Well, they were the first to declare independence and the last to vote for the Constitution.
Yes.
Is disrespect for onerous and counterproductive regulations in our bones as a people, or have modern Americans pretty much been broken to the will of the administrative state?
I don't think so. Maybe I'm always an optimist, and I just don't believe that those fundamental values have been stripped out of the American character. We live in a very complicated world, and we need a lot of regulation. In 1789, they didn't have to worry about radios or railroads or airplanes and et cetera. All of those things need to be regulated so we don't run into each other. But then, regulators love to regulate, and the bigger their mandate, the better they like it. And so they're always trying to increase regulation. And we have to fight back and say, we don't need this. And I think what happens is you get a wave of regulation, then it gets peeled back, and then there's another wave of regulation.
And these have come through many times in our history. Certainly we had some rebellions over it as well, didn't we?
Well, it was the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when the farmers in western Pennsylvania, it was so difficult to communicate with the eastern United States over the Appalachian Mountains that the only way they could sell their grain profitably was to turn it into whiskey first, make a much higher value product. And then when the government put a tax on whiskey, they rebelled rather briefly. It didn't really amount to much. Mm-hmm. It's the only time in American history when the commander-in-chief led troops in the field.
That's right. Washington got on a horse and rode out there. So aside from the Whiskey Rebellion, independence brought a lot of new challenges and possibilities. Why was it easier for the new United States to adopt the newly emerging free market ideas of Adam Smith than it was for older Western nations?
Well, in Europe, they'd had centuries of privilege. In France, for instance, a lot of the nobility had been given the right to collect a tariff for goods passing through their land. And so, if you were trying to sell a wagon load of goods from Rouen to Marseille, not that anybody would have tried to do that, they would have had to pass through 700 or 800 different tariffs. And we didn't have any of that. We didn't have this entrenched aristocracy used to its privileges and determined to keep them. We had some fairly rich people, but we didn't have that tradition at all. And so Adam Smith really took hold in the United States sooner than he did in Britain or, heaven knows, the continent.
It took a while to put a governing system together to make it all work. I mean, in 1789, the U.S. government was a financial basket case. It was unable to pay its bills. It couldn't borrow money. What changed that?
Alexander Hamilton changed it.
You're a bit of an Alexander Hamilton scholar. Tell us the key points.
Well, he was astonishingly young. He was either 32 or 35. There's some dispute as to when he was born. But he was as close you can get to being a genius. And he realized he was very well read. He was enormously energetic. He would have tired anybody out. And he knew what needed to be done in order to establish faith in the federal government and in the federal government's ability to pay its debts. And that, of course, allowed us the possibility of borrowing money. Mm-hmm. And he was fiercely opposed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, but he managed to get it through. And, in 1789, the United States was a financial basket case. We couldn't even pay the interest on the debt, let alone pay back the principal. By 1795, American bonds were selling at a 10% premium in Europe.
At what point would you say that America really became the Colossus that it is today?
America became the Colossus it is today with World War I. World War I was the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century. We still live in its shadow. And it destroyed Europe because the Second World War was simply World War I, Act II.
Refought, right.
And Europe had been the center of Western culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. But even the victors, France and Britain, were
exhausted,
financially deeply hurt by the war. I mean, in the 1920s, 40% of the British government's money was going to pay interest on the debt they'd run up in World War I, which made it very difficult for them to invest in other things. The center of world finance had been London. By 1918, the center of world finance was New York.
And that's when the American century began.
Yes, I think the American century began with World War I. Because remember, also, when the war broke out in August of 1914, every stock exchange in the world closed. And New York didn't reopen it was about 3 months before it opened at all. And then it was 6 months before it was back to normal. But by 1915, people were beginning to understand that while this war was going to devastate Europe, it was going to be very profitable for the United States. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average, its biggest increase single-year increase was 1915. It went up by 83%.
And was off to the races from there.
Yeah.
So, John, banks have a checkered history of failure and bailouts that continue to this day. Among all our industries, what makes banking so singularly unable to sort out its problems?
Well, I think the main trouble with American banking is that the regulatory structure is so complex and so convoluted that there's just dozens of different regulatory bodies, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the controller of the currency, state banking authorities, the FDIC, and on and on and on. Unfortunately, because the Jeffersonians killed the Bank of the United States, which was the central bank, we didn't have a central bank for nearly 80 years, from 1836 to 1913. And the state banks were proliferated. There were thousands of them, and many of them were very badly regulated by the states. Some of them were called wildcat banks because their headquarters were out among the wildcats, which made it very difficult. If you wanted to redeem their banknotes, you had to go to their headquarters. Mm-hmm. And so half the banks founded in the 1820s had failed by 1840. In the 1840s, there were thousands of different issues of currency. In the Civil War, we reformed it a great deal. We established national banks, and we put the state banks out of the currency business. But we didn't quite get rid of the state banks, and that was a pity. So by 1920s, there were 20,000 banks in the United States. That's more than all the rest of the world put together. And when the economy began to go sour, these small banks, rural banks, began to fail one after another, about 500 a year during the so-called prosperous 1920s. And then with the Great Depression, it was just a cascade of bank failure, about 5,000 altogether. We still haven't quite got it organized properly, and I'm not sure we ever will.
Now we've got them herded into about 6 banks that are too big to fail.
Well, that's another problem, I think. It seems to me if a bank is too big to fail, then you got to do either one of two things. The first thing you can do is simply regulate it like a public utility so that it can't fail.
Which is happening.
And the other is to break it up so that it's not too big to fail.
Well, we're going to be dealing with those for the years ahead. Let's go back in time again. The U.S. is a sprawling country which made transportation the key to development. Share some of your stories with us. Start with canals.
The governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton was his name. He saw a great opportunity in this geographic accident, which was that the whole Appalachian Mountain chain, which runs from Vermont all the way down to Georgia, the only place where you could build a canal, cross it, was in New York State, where the Mohawk River comes into the Hudson. And he was determined to do it, and he started in 1817. It finished in 1825. It came in ahead of schedule and under budget.
That doesn't happen very often.
That doesn't happen very often in government projects. And the result was simply astonishing because the Trans-Appalachian West, most of their produce, and they were growing very, very rapidly at this point, had no choice but to go down the Mississippi River and through the port of New Orleans, and then around Florida and back up to the East Coast or to Europe. With the Erie Canal, that produce could flow through the Great Lakes, through the Erie Canal and the Hudson River down to New York City and the port of New York. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet, the father of the Supreme Court justice, said that New York has become that tongue that is licking up the cream of commerce of a continent. And New York just became the biggest boomtown in the history of the world.
And it continues to be the center of so much activity. The next big fight was in steamboats. Tell us about that.
The steamboat was invented, or at least the first commercially successful steamboat was Robert Fulton's Clermont, which was launched in 1807. And Fulton and his partner, Robert Livingston, who was very well connected politically in New York — Livingstons were a big, powerful family — they had been given a monopoly on steamboat navigation in New York waters. They defined that as running up to high tide on New Jersey. And New Jersey was not very pleased with this, as you can imagine. So he hired a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, a young ship captain, and they fought the monopoly and sued. And then finally in 1824, the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that the monopoly was illegal because it interfered with interstate commerce, and the federal government had complete authority over interstate commerce. And Charles Warren, the historian of the Supreme Court, called this the Declaration of Independence of the American Market.
Mm-hmm.
And so within a couple of years, instead of being 6 steamboats in New York, there were 40. And the prices had come down wonderfully because monopolies love high prices. And so this allowed interstate commerce to flourish much more quickly than it had been flourishing. And that, of course, is essential to a growing economy.
Well, if you read through the book, you see constant battles between competitors in the marketplace and competitors in the political world. Corruption and bribing legislators had been a way of life in the U.S., and some say it still is, although most of it's classified as campaign donations now. What are some of the most notorious episodes of legislative bribery in American history?
Well, my favorite, of course, is 1868, when the New York State Legislature passed a bill duly signed into law by the governor, the effect of which was to legalize bribery. Because the law said that no conviction shall be had on a charge of bribery based solely upon the testimony of one party to the bribe. And that meant in those days that as long as you took your money in cash and in private, you could not be convicted of bribery.
How did that work out?
Well, in 1873, when the Tweed ring was broken, they passed actually they put it into the New York State Constitution. So the law against bribery is in the Constitution of the state of New York, where the legislature can't get at it.
And yet political pull still mattered quite a bit. Tell us a bit about the growth of the railroads through that period.
Well, railroads were a fundamentally new technology. For the first time in history, overland transportation of freight became cheap. And transportation is what's known as a transaction cost. So the lower the cost of transportation, the lower the cost of the goods.
Mm-hmm.
And so railroads were enormously important in the growth of the 19th century economy, but they were very expensive to build. And also at the beginning, they didn't really know how to run a railroad.
There was a lot of experimentation.
Yes, indeed. I mean, at one point, they actually thought that railroads might function as common carriers, that you could put your own locomotive on the tracks. And they found out that didn't
work too well. But ultimately, they standardized everything. In fact, they were even responsible for standard time.
In the old days, before railroads, every town had its own time based on its local noon.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant for roughly the latitude in New York, for every 11 miles you go west, noon is 1 minute later. And so railroad schedules became a nightmare because you would often leave one town and get to the next town before you had left the first town. And so Congress was just dithering and, they couldn't do it. So the railroads got together and just said, this is railroad standard time. And some people objected. They said we should live on God's time, not on Vanderbilt's time. But within a few years, it was so convenient that everybody forgot about it. And now we have, thank heavens, standard time.
As the railroads grew, they were looking to organize themselves, and the Interstate Commerce Commission came along. Tell us about the history of that.
The railroads, of course, became enormously powerful, and they were the biggest industry in the country by the 1880s. And where the railroads had to compete with each other, the so-called trunk lines, like running between Chicago and New York, where you could ship your goods on the Pennsylvania, on the New York Central, on the Baltimore and Ohio, or on the Erie.
Yep.
So on those trunk lines, they fiercely competed, or they tried to form cartels so they didn't have to compete. But on the branch lines, where they had a monopoly, that's where they could make their money. And so if you were a manufacturer in Altoona, Pennsylvania, well, you had to ship your goods on the Pennsylvania Railroad, or you didn't ship them.
Right.
And so the Pennsylvania Railroad could stick it to you, and of course they did. So in 1889, the government established the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was supposed to keep the railroads from doing that kind of a thing and forcing the railroads to compete. And what happened, actually, was that the ICC quickly became the cartel mechanism. And the railroads became effectively a cartel because the ICC could set prices. And so innovation just stopped. And the American railroads began to decline, and they continued declining up until the 1970s, when the ICC had most of its power taken away. It took them another 15 years to actually abolish the ICC. Spent 15 years in the 1980s doing absolutely nothing.
Isn't that pattern of regulatory capture of an agency that's meant to control an industry that ends up being a cartel agent for the industry pretty common in American history? Yes,
it is. And the reason is simple enough, is that when they establish something like the ICC to regulate railroads, well, they need experts on railroads to know what to do. And so where do you find experts on railroads? Well, you find them in the railroads.
Yep.
And so pretty soon the tail was wagging the dog here.
It happened in telecom, happened in the airline industry. It seems to happen over and over again.
It does. And also in modern times, we have had an oddity of they're not regulating commerce, so they're regulating like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has been largely captured by the professional environmentalists.
And they have their own agenda.
And they certainly have their own agenda, which is deeply anti-commerce. And also they're deeply misanthropic. The only species on planet Earth they don't like is Homo sapiens. And they think we should get on our rocket ship and go back to Mars where we came from.
Well, that may happen someday if they keep it up. As we run out of time and I look through the large arc of your book, you sort of fast forward to the present. Very recently you wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal that was subtitled, "The Sheep Are Quite Capable of Looking Out for Themselves." As you sum up this history of American economic development, what do you have to say about our ability to take care of ourselves?
Well, I think we are quite capable of taking care of ourselves. At the heart of liberalism, there lies a deep belief in human incapacity to govern themselves. They think most people are too stupid to zip their own flies without instructions from the government. And that's not true. Our capacity to govern ourselves is undiminished.
So looking ahead, are you an optimist?
Yes, I'm an optimist. I'm just, made that way. The glass is always half full.
What are the bright stars you see shining in our economy looking ahead?
Well, we are still in the early stages of a profound technological revolution. The most profound since the Industrial Revolution of 250 years ago, and probably the most profound since agriculture 10,000 years ago. Already in my lifetime, what has changed is just absolutely astonishing. Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer, once said that any technology sufficiently advanced will appear as magic.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody died in, say, 1970, and you wake him up today.
Hand him an iPhone.
And show him an iPhone. He would not understand what it was.
Yeah, it's magic, isn't it? That will carry us forward. John, I wish we had more time. I'm going to have to go back and read some of your other books. Thanks for coming on the show.
I'm glad to be here.
That was John Steele Gordon, author of An Empire of Wealth, Rise of the American Economy, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, Edward Stringham, professor of economic organizations and innovations at Trinity College, offers a somewhat different perspective on how to make America great again. Stay tuned.